Okay, so we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff today, folks. We're talking about the justice system, but not in the way you might think. We're going deep into this justice commodification report you sent over, and let me tell you, it's got my head spinning a bit.
Yeah, it's not exactly light reading. The thing is, it doesn't just lay out some theoretical problem. It gets into how the desire for profit, like actual money, might be messing with how fair our courts really are.
Right now.
Yeah, and they don't dance around it either. The report jumps right into examples. Like, did you know that there are private prison companies, actual companies, that are issuing bonds that go up in value if more people are put in prison?
It's wild, right? And it's not just those private companies, it's happening more broadly. Think about it, cities and towns. They need money too, right? So they take things like parking tickets, court fees, bundle them together like a package deal, and suddenly, bam, they've got a reason to hand out more punishments. It's like the report says, the court system becomes a way to make money. But it gets, I don't know, almost scary. They start talking about things like if you're behind on child support payments or you have some old debt you haven't paid, they're bundling that stuff up too and trading it.
Yeah, and they've got a fancy name for it. Structured legal obligations, or SLOs.
Yeah.
Basically, it's like someone's betting on whether people like you and me are going to fail to pay our bills.
Wait, so you're telling me it's not enough that some companies are making money off prisons? Now Wall Street's trying to cash in on everyday people struggling? This is where it starts to feel really wrong. And get this, the report even talks about international investors getting involved in all
Oh
this.
yeah, it's global now. They're scooping up these legal obligations like they're some hot commodity. Basically, our legal system's becoming just another thing to make money off of on a global scale.
It's mind-blowing, really. And if that wasn't enough, they even bring up birth certificates and social security numbers.
Right, because those aren't just about who you are. They represent how much money you might make that the government can tax in the future.
Hold on, are you saying my birth certificate is somehow connected to, like, the national debt?
Well, kind of. Think of it as your potential to earn money
Wow.
and how the government factors that into their financial plans.
Whoa, okay, that's a lot to take in. So we're like collateral from the moment we're born.
In a way, yeah. And this all ties back into the courts because if the government needs more cash, well, one way to get it is through more fines and fees. The report even talks about how judges might feel pressure, maybe without even realizing it, to give out harsher sentences just to keep the money flowing.
That's disturbing. Are you saying judges are being told to basically act like debt collectors?
The report uses Ferguson, Missouri as a big example.
Mm.
That's the case back in 2015. Well, the Department of Justice found out that court officials there were actually being told to bring in as much money as they could through fines.
See, that just feels wrong. The court's supposed to be about justice, not about how much money they can squeeze out of people.
Right. And unfortunately, the report found that this wasn't just happening in Ferguson. They saw evidence of it in different places all over the country.
And get this, it gets even crazier. They found that credit rating agencies, those companies that give ratings to cities and states, they're involved too.
Oh, yeah, those agencies, they look at how much money a court system can pull in through fines. If a city's not punishing people enough to make enough money, their credit rating can get downgraded. It's like they get penalized for not being harsh enough.
It's messed up.
It really is. And to really understand how deep this goes, we need to look at some examples. One of the big ones they highlight is these private prison companies, places like CoreCivic and GEO Group.
Okay, so break this down for me. How are these private prisons connected to all this talk about justice being bought and sold?
Well, think about it. These are companies, right? Their whole business model, unfortunately, relies on people being locked up. To get investors, they offer corporate bonds. But the thing is, those bonds are tied to how much money the company's making. More prisoners equals more profits, which makes their investors happy.
So investors are making money off people being in prison.
That's one way to look at it. And the report even uses CoreCivic's own words to back this up. In their 2022 report, they said that if there were fewer people in prison, they might not be able to pay back their bondholders.
So it's not just about having prisons, it's about making sure those prisons stay full to keep the money rolling in.
Exactly. And this isn't just private companies either. Remember how we were talking about cities bundling up those fines? Well, they're doing something similar with something called municipal bonds.
Okay, remind me again, how do those work?
It's like this. Cities and towns need money for roads, schools, all that stuff, right? One way they get it is by issuing these municipal bonds. But what's messed up is that some cities are relying on the money they get from court fines and fees to pay back these bonds.
So they're not just trying to balance the budget, they're creating a system where the courts have to keep handing out fines to pay off debts.
Exactly. The report actually uses Chicago as an example. Their financial report from 2021 straight up lists the money they get from court fines as part of their plan to pay off their municipal bonds.
So we're talking about a system where punishing people is how cities are making money.
You got it. And honestly, we're just scratching the surface here. This report goes way deeper, looking at how international investments and government debt play into all of this.
This is already a lot to unpack. Before we go any further, I want to go back to those SLOs, those structured legal obligations. You were explaining how they bundle up stuff like unpaid child support or old debts. Walk me through how that actually works.
Sure. So say you owe some money, maybe an old credit card bill or a medical bill, whatever. Now imagine that debt, along with thousands of other people's debts just like it, all getting bundled together into this big old portfolio by some financial institution.
So they're taking a bunch of individual IOUs and turning them into this giant package deal.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting. These portfolios, these SLOs, they get traded, bought, and sold in private markets, just like stocks or bonds.
Wait, so people are literally investing in the possibility that others will fail.
Pretty much. And just like with any investment, they're looking at how much money they could make. The report even mentions this Morgan Stanley thing from 2020, an investment prospectus for these SLOs.
It's a little messed up, don't you think? Someone literally profiting off someone else's hardship.
Yeah.
And what's even scarier is what this could mean for the idea of justice itself. If making money is now tied to how the legal system works, can we really be sure it's fair?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There's no easy answer. But the fact that we're even asking these questions shows how serious this problem is.
Absolutely. And to make things even more complicated, international investors are now looking at this stuff. It's not just a local problem anymore.
Nope, it's global. Globalization means investors all over the world are looking for new ways to make money. And some of them see the U.S. justice system, with all its fines and penalties, as a potential gold mine.
So they're looking at our legal system like it's just another way to make a profit.
Pretty much. The report actually talks about a 2021 report from Goldman Sachs, the investment bank. They actually include U.S. legal obligations, those court fines we were talking about, in their global investment portfolios.
That's chilling. They call them secured revenue streams because they figure the government's always going to be there to enforce them. But doesn't that just make it more likely that the system will be used to generate revenue?
That's the concern. The report makes it clear that calling these obligations secure investments could make things even worse. International investors see them as a safe bet, which could pressure cities and companies to double down on these practices.
Okay, so let's recap. We've got private prisons making money off people being locked up, cities using fines and fees to pay off their debts, international investors wanting a piece of the action, and our own struggles turned into investment opportunities for someone else. And if that wasn't enough, now we've got states making deals with private companies to guarantee profits from those fines and fees.
Don't forget, all while our potential future earnings are being treated as collateral.
Right. It's overwhelming, really. Where do we even go from here?
Well, remember those birth certificates and Social Security numbers we were talking about. This is where it gets really interesting and concerning. We'll dive into that next. It's easy to think about all this as some kind of like Wall Street gain that doesn't really affect us, but the report gets into how this stuff hits way closer to home than you might think. Like, even something as basic as a birth certificate gets pulled into this whole system.
Yeah, that's the part that really threw me off, is just a piece of paper saying you were born, right?
Yeah.
How does that become some kind of financial asset?
Well, it's not that the birth certificate itself gets traded or anything, but it's what it represents. It's the key to a Social Security number.
Which is how the government tracks our income for taxes, right?
Exactly. So, in a financial sense, a new birth certificate means a new taxpayer is entering the system.
Hmm.
And that future tax revenue, the government really counts on that.
Okay, that makes sense. But how does that tie back into this whole justice thing being bought and sold? We've gone from courtrooms to, like, delivery rooms now.
It all comes down to government debt. Governments need money to function, and one way they get it is by borrowing. They issue bonds, basically borrowing from people, companies, even other countries.
Okay, I get that.
But anyone lending money wants to be sure they'll get paid back. That's where things get a little, I don't know, interesting. The report highlights how future tax revenue often acts as collateral for this debt.
Wait, hold on. So are you saying they're basically telling lenders, hey, we're good for this loan because we've got all these babies being born who will be paying taxes someday?
In a way, yeah. And get this, The report uses the 2021 U.S. Treasury report on the Social Security Trust Fund as evidence. This report shows how those Social Security numbers linked to birth certificates are used to figure out how much tax revenue they'll get in the future. And that calculation, yeah, it gets factored into national debt calculations.
It's like not only are our legal problems seen as commodities, our very existence as future taxpayers is part of this financial machine.
Exactly. And that brings up some really unsettling questions, like what happens when the government sees its citizens mainly as sources of income? How does that affect how laws are made, how they're enforced, how justice is actually carried out?
It's a scary thought for sure. And the report doesn't stop there. It talks about some states guaranteeing a minimum amount of revenue from these court-imposed penalties. How does that even work?
Well, it takes us back to that pressure on the courts to generate revenue. We
Yeah.
talked about cities using that money to repay bonds, but some states have gone even further. They've basically made deals with companies or financial institutions promising a certain amount of revenue from fines and fees.
So it's like they're saying, we promise to collect at least this much in fines, and if we don't, we'll cover the difference ourselves.
Yep, that's the gist of it. The report highlights a contract from 2018 between the Louisiana State Department of Corrections and this private company called SecureTech. That contract, according to the report, guaranteed a minimum amount of revenue from court-imposed fines and fees. If the courts didn't bring in enough, the state would make up the difference to make sure those bondholders got paid.
That's crazy. It's like they're outsourcing the collection of fines and guaranteeing a profit to a private company, and all the while putting huge pressure on the courts to actually hand down those fines.
It really makes you think, is the priority actually justice or just making a profit? When you build these financial incentives into the system, it's really hard to ignore the potential for abuse and for people to lose trust in the fairness of the legal system.
Okay, let's recap for a second because this is a lot. We've got private prisons issuing bonds that are tied to how many people are behind bars. We've got cities using fines and fees to pay off their debts. And on top of that, international investors are getting in on the action, and our struggles to pay off debts are turned into investment opportunities for someone else. Then we have states making deals to guarantee profits from those fines and fees, all while our own potential future earnings are being treated as collateral. Did I miss anything?
You got it all. It's a lot to take in, but the important thing is that we're talking about it. By shining a light on these issues, we can start to see the potential problems and look for ways to protect the integrity of the justice system.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power. And we've only just started to scratch the surface. Before we go any further, though, there's one more piece of this I want to understand. The report talks about court systems relying on fines and fees to fund their own operating budgets.
Right, and that's a point that often gets missed. We talked about how those revenues are used to pay back bonds and even make money for private companies, but in a lot of places, they also make up a huge part of a court's budget.
So it's not just about paying off debt or making someone rich, it's about keeping the lights on in the courthouse.
Exactly. The report mentions the California Judicial Council Financial Report from 2020. It found that over 60% of local court revenue in California comes from fines and fees. And a big chunk of the state court budget relies on these funds, too.
Wow, that's a huge dependence on money that comes from punishing people. I can see how that could easily create a conflict of interest or at least raise questions about whether the courts can be impartial.
You're right, and it's not just California. The report found similar situations in courts all across the country. They rely on this revenue to fund their day-to-day operations.
So if they're not bringing in enough money through fines and fees, does that mean they have to cut back on things like court staff or public defenders?
It's definitely possible, and the report brings that up. According to their findings, a drop in penalties could mean big budget shortfalls, and that would make it harder for the courts to do their job.
Okay, so it feels like we're in a tough spot. We're worried about justice being treated like a product and courts feeling the pressure to make money, but if they don't bring in that money, the courts might not be able to function at all. What do we do about this?
That's the big question, and there's no easy answer.
It's complicated, but just talking about it is a good start, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We need more transparency, and for people to be aware of what's driving these practices, that's how we can move towards a system that's more fair and just for everyone.
I'm with you on that. We've covered a lot today, but there's one last part of this report we need to unpack. Social Security being used as collateral for government debt. It's a bit confusing, but it's connected to everything else we've been discussing.
Right. It all goes back to this idea of how future earnings fit into the bigger picture of finance. We've talked about birth certificates and future tax revenue, but Social Security is a huge part of this equation too.
So how does that work? Is the government literally taking money out of the Social Security Trust Fund to pay off its debts?
It's a bit more complicated than that. The Social Security system isn't directly used to pay back debt, but the money it's expected to bring in is definitely a factor in the government's borrowing strategy.
Okay, I'm not sure I follow. Can you explain it a bit more?
Sure. When the government borrows money, they have to prove to lenders that they'll be able to pay it back eventually. One way they do that is by showing how much revenue they expect to receive in the future. The Social Security system, with millions of people contributing and projected future income, represents a massive amount of potential revenue.
So they're essentially saying, look, we have this huge program that people pay into their whole working lives, and that money's going to keep coming in for decades. We're good for the loan.
That's one way to put it. And the report uses the Congressional Budget Office's long-term budget outlook from 2021 as evidence of this. The report shows how future Social Security payments are part of the government's plans for borrowing and managing debt.
Wow. So it's not enough that our legal problems are treated like things to be bought and sold. Our future retirement contributions are part of this whole financial web, too.
It's definitely something to think about. It shows how connected these issues really are. When we talk about justice becoming a commodity, it's not just about isolated cases of courts being pressured to generate revenue. It's about a system where even our most basic social programs are tied to financial markets and debt.
This is a lot to process. It makes you wonder about what this means in the long run, both for the justice system and for society as a whole.
It really does. But I think the most important thing to take away from all of this is the need for transparency and awareness. We have to shine a light on these practices if we want to have an honest conversation about the role of money in our justice system. And we need to find ways to make sure that justice, not profit, is the main priority.
Couldn't agree more. Now, as much as I wish we were at the end of this report, there's one last thing we need to unpack, and it's big. The report shows evidence that judges are being pressured to give out harsher sentences just to bring in more revenue. We're going there. Stick with us as we get into the most disturbing part of this report. So we're talking about judges, actual judges, maybe being pressured to give out harsher sentences, like tougher punishments just to make more money. That's a serious claim.
It is, and the report doesn't take it lightly. They go beyond just asking the question. They point to real cases where this seems to have actually happened.
And the biggest example they give is Ferguson, Missouri. Back in 2015, the Department of Justice investigated the Ferguson Police Department and their court system after the shooting of Michael Brown. That case sparked a huge conversation about racial bias in policing.
Right, and while the report acknowledges that important context, it digs into something else the DOJ found, something really troubling about how the Ferguson Municipal Court was operating.
What do you mean?
Well, the DOJ found that court officials weren't just encouraged to bring in as much money as possible from fines and fees. They were basically told they had to do it.
So it wasn't enough to hold people accountable for breaking the law. They were actually using the court to make money for the city.
That's what the DOJ concluded. And the report even uses pieces of emails between people in the court and city administrators that show this focus on getting more money from fines to boost the city's budget. They even talked about giving out bigger fines just to hit their revenue targets.
That's just wrong. This isn't some dystopian future. These are real people's lives. The court is supposed to be about justice, not squeezing every penny out of people, especially those who are already struggling.
Exactly. And the report makes that point really clear. These practices often hit low-income communities and communities of color the hardest. It creates a system where justice isn't equal. If you can afford it, you can pay your way out of trouble. If you can't, you face much harsher consequences, even for small offenses.
It's like we're punishing people for being poor. And the fact that this was happening in Ferguson, a place already dealing with so much racial tension and lack of trust in law enforcement, just makes it that much worse.
Absolutely. This case shows us that the things we're talking about aren't just abstract ideas. These financial incentives built into the justice system have very real consequences, and they can be incredibly damaging.
This is a lot to take in, and I'm sure some people listening are feeling overwhelmed, maybe even a little hopeless. But I think it's important to remember that bringing these problems to light is the first step to fixing them.
I agree. This report isn't trying to discourage us, it's trying to wake us up. It's telling us to take a hard look at the systems we've created and ask ourselves what's truly important. Do we want a justice system that puts profit first? Or do we want one that prioritizes fairness, rehabilitation, and upholding the law for everyone?
That is the question, isn't it? And I wish we had easy answers. But it starts with awareness. By understanding how these systems work and how the desire for profit can undermine justice, we can demand better. We can demand transparency from our leaders, accountability from our courts, and a commitment to creating a more just and fair society for everyone.
Well said. Sometimes a little bit of outrage can be a powerful motivator for change.
It's true. Okay, so we've covered a lot in this deep dive. We went deep into how our justice system has become so entangled with the world of finance. Private prisons, city bonds, international investors turning our legal troubles and even our future potential earnings into commodities.
And we had to face some hard truths about what this might mean for the fairness of a system that's supposed to ensure justice for everyone.
It's a lot to think about, and this conversation definitely doesn't end here. We encourage you to keep learning, keep asking those tough questions, and don't be afraid to demand better from the systems that shape our lives. A more just and equitable future is possible, but we all need to stay informed, engaged, and committed to making it happen.
I couldn't agree more.
That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.
I the only sovereign, him give me the key. Him a the highest king, and me a follow, you see. Me know about to Babylon, them can't control me. The system can't take me soul, just set me free. Jah the only sovereign, him give me the key. Him a the highest king, and me a follow, you see. Me know about to Babylon, them can't control me. The system can't take me soul, just set me free. Them build them laws, the control we mind. Them take rights and blind the mankind. Fiat money and contract them sign, but when I sign nothing, Jah is my guide all the time. We no live